January 29, 1945. Holzheim, Belgium, a frozen village pressed against the German border, buried under snow so deep it swallowed men to their waists. The temperature had not risen above freezing in weeks. The sky was a flat sheet of grey that seemed close enough to touch. First Sergeant Leonard Funk walked around the corner of a stone farmhouse and straight into a nightmare. 80 German soldiers stood in the yard. They were armed. The 4 American guards who had been watching them moments earlier were disarmed, hands raised, faces white with terror. A German officer stepped forward and shoved a machine pistol directly into Funk's stomach. Hard enough to feel the muzzle through his belt buckle, hard enough to bruise. The officer screamed in German. The message needed no translation. "Surrender. Drop your weapon. You are captured." Leonard Funk was 5 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed 140 pounds. He was carrying a Thompson submachine gun slung over his right shoulder, loaded 30 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition in the magazine. Safety off. It was always off with Funk. He had roughly 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. 100 armed enemy soldiers surrounded him. His own men were prisoners. There was no backup coming. No air support. No artillery. No cavalry. Just one undersized paratrooper from western Pennsylvania with a gun in his gut and the worst odds any American soldier faced in the entire Second World War. He chose to fight. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become one of the most extraordinary Medal of Honor actions in the history of the United States Army. But to understand what Leonard Funk did in that frozen Belgian farmyard, and why he did it, you need to understand who he was long before the war ever found him. You need to understand the man the Army almost overlooked entirely. Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. was born on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Braddock sat in the shadow of Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel Works, about 10 miles east of downtown Pittsburgh. It was a place where the sky glowed orange at night from the blast furnaces, where the air tasted like iron filings, and where the Monongahela River ran brown with industrial runoff. The town was built on steel. The men who lived there were forged even harder. Funk's childhood was shaped by loss before he was old enough to understand what loss meant. His mother died when he was still a young boy. There was no large extended family to absorb the blow, no safety net to catch a child falling through grief. Young Leonard grew up fast. He learned to take care of himself and his family. He learned to cook meals from whatever was available. He learned to keep a household running. He learned, at an age when other boys were playing in the streets, that the world does not slow down because you are hurting. You keep moving, or the world leaves you behind. That lesson would define every decision he ever made. He graduated from high school in 1934, right in the gut of the Great Depression. Unemployment in the steel towns of western Pennsylvania hovered near 30%. The mills were laying off experienced men, not hiring boys fresh out of school. College was a fantasy reserved for families with money the Funks did not have. Leonard found work as a store clerk in nearby Wilkinsburg. He stocked shelves, he swept floors, he counted inventory in the back room. He earned enough to keep food on the table and a roof over his head, nothing more. 5 feet 5 inches, 140 pounds. A quiet young man from a dying steel town who had buried his mother and now spent his days selling goods across a counter for wages that barely covered rent. Nobody looked at Leonard Funk and saw a soldier. Nobody looked at him and saw a warrior. Nobody looked at him and saw anything remarkable at all. That was their mistake. It was a mistake the German army would pay for, with 21 lives on a frozen morning 11 years later. On a day in June of 1941, 6 months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and dragged America into the war, Leonard Funk entered the United States Army from Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. His Army service number was 33070198. He was 24 years old. He reported for induction and entered the United States Army as a private, with no military experience and no particular expectations. Basic training at various stateside camps changed nothing about his size. It changed everything else. Funk was faster than men who stood 6 feet tall. He was tougher than men who weighed 200 pounds. He was more aggressive in close combat than soldiers who outweighed him by 60 pounds. He could run 5 miles in full gear and arrive at the finish, barely breathing hard, while bigger men collapsed on the roadside. He could shoot with both precision and speed. He could navigate at night by compass alone. The drill sergeants noticed him, the officers noticed him, his fellow recruits noticed him. When the army put out the call for volunteers for the newly forming airborne divisions, for men willing to jump out of perfectly good aircraft into enemy territory, Leonard Funk stepped forward without a moment of hesitation. The paratroopers were the elite of the army. Their physical standards were the most demanding in the entire military. Candidates endured 5-mile runs before breakfast, hundreds of push-ups and sit-ups daily, hand-to-hand combat drills that left their knuckles raw and their muscles screaming. They jumped from 34-foot towers, then from 250-foot towers, and finally from C-47 transport planes at altitudes as low as 800 feet. The washout rate was brutal. Bigger men failed, stronger men quit. Men who looked like they belonged on recruiting posters rang the bell and went back to regular infantry. Funk passed every test. He did not just pass, he excelled. His compact frame became a tactical advantage he would exploit for the rest of the war. He was harder to hit. He moved faster through doorways and windows. He could squeeze through gaps in hedgerows, walls, and rubble that stopped bigger soldiers cold. He presented a smaller target to snipers and machine gunners. And his endurance, built from years of working-class labor in the steel country, was something his instructors had rarely seen. Funk was assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 508th was activated at Camp Blanding, Florida, on October 20, 1942, under Major Roy Lindquist, who was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on or around the date of activation. For the next 14 months, the regiment trained relentlessly. Night jumps into unfamiliar terrain. Forced marches of 20 and 30 miles with full combat loads. Live fire exercises where real bullets cracked overhead. Close-quarters battle drills in mock villages built specifically to simulate house-to-house fighting. The 508th was being forged into one of the sharpest weapons in the American arsenal, and Leonard Funk was rapidly becoming its finest edge. He rose through the enlisted ranks with a speed that reflected both his competence and his natural authority. By the time the regiment shipped out from New York Harbor on December 28, 1943, Funk held the rank of First Sergeant of Company C, First Sergeant, the highest enlisted position in the company, the man responsible for every soldier, every weapon, every round of ammunition, every piece of gear. The man who enforced discipline, managed logistics, coordinated training, and served as the critical link between the company commander and the enlisted ranks, the man everyone depended on. The regiment arrived in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on January 8, 1944. By March, they moved south to Wallerton Park in Nottinghamshire, England, where the 508th was officially attached to Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division. The All-Americans, one of the most famous fighting formations in the history of the United States military. Funk and Company C were about to be thrown into the largest invasion the world had ever seen. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, thousands of American paratroopers climbed aboard C-47 transport planes at airfields spread across southern England. Leonard Funk was among them, his Thompson submachine gun strapped to his side, his parachute rigged tight against his back. The aircraft formed up into enormous formations, over 800 planes strong, and turned south across the English Channel. Below them in the darkness, the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history was steaming toward the beaches of Normandy. Over 5,000 ships, carrying 150,000 soldiers who would storm ashore at dawn. Funk's mission was part of the airborne spearhead, the tip of the invasion sword. The paratroopers were to drop behind the German coastal defences hours before the beach landings, seize critical roads, bridges, and crossroads, and prevent German panzer reserves from counterattacking the beaches while the infantry was still vulnerable in the surf. Funk jumped into the darkness over Normandy at approximately 02:15 hours. The drop was chaos. High winds scattered the transport aircraft across miles of Norman countryside. Heavy German anti-aircraft fire forced pilots to take violent, evasive action, throwing paratroopers off their feet inside the fuselages and hurling them out the doors at wrong altitudes and wrong locations. Low cloud cover obscured every landmark the navigators depended on. Men from the same company landed miles apart. Some paratroopers came down in flooded fields that the Germans had deliberately inundated, and drowned under the weight of their equipment before they could cut free of their harnesses. Others landed directly on top of German positions and were killed in their parachutes. Funk landed nearly 20 miles from his designated drop zone near Picauville. The impact badly sprained his ankle. He was alone, injured, in enemy-occupied territory, in total darkness, with no idea where his unit was and no way to communicate with anyone. Most men in that situation would have found cover and waited. A hedgerow, a ditch, a bombed-out barn. They would have hidden until daylight, until friendly forces found them, until the situation clarified. That was the rational response, the safe response. Funk did the opposite. He started moving immediately. Limping through the Norman bocage on his damaged ankle, navigating by compass and by the distant sounds of gunfire, he began working his way through enemy-held countryside. As he moved, he gathered scattered paratroopers. One man crouching in a drainage ditch, 2 more pressed against a stone wall, rifles pointed at every shadow. 3 soldiers sheltering in a shell-damaged farmhouse who had not moved since landing because they had no idea which direction to go. Funk collected them one by one, a first sergeant rebuilding his command from fragments in the middle of enemy territory. Within hours, he had assembled 18 paratroopers from multiple units. None of them knew their exact position. All of them knew they were deep behind German lines with enemy patrols active all around them. Funk assumed command without discussion. He was the ranking man, and he was the most capable man, and every soldier in that group knew it. He led them across 20 miles of enemy territory, the distance recorded in his official Silver Star citation. He navigated around German strongpoints using terrain and darkness as cover. He avoided enemy patrols when stealth was possible. He fought through them when it was not. He crossed flooded fields where the water reached his chest. He led them through hedgerow after hedgerow, the thick Norman earthen walls that channeled movement and created natural kill zones for defenders. After 3 scouts were lost to enemy contact, Funk himself took the point position and led the main body the rest of the way. He brought all 18 men in the main group to friendly lines alive and ready to fight. For this action, First Sergeant Leonard Funk was awarded the Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in the United States Army. The fighting in Normandy continued through the summer of 1944. The hedgerow country, which the French called bocage, was a nightmare that no amount of training had prepared the Allies for. The Norman landscape was divided into thousands of small fields, each enclosed by ancient earthen embankments, 1 to 4 feet thick at the base, topped by hedges and tangled vegetation reaching anywhere from 3 to 15 feet tall. These hedgerows created a natural fortress around every single field. A German machine gun team could set up behind one hedgerow, cover the entire open ground of the field in front of them, and be virtually invisible to attackers. When the Americans finally fought their way across one field and over the hedgerow, they found another identical field and another identical hedgerow beyond it, occupied by another German position. The advance measured progress in yards, not miles. Every crossroad was pre-registered by German mortar teams who could drop shells with pinpoint accuracy within seconds of a target appearing. Snipers operated from the upper windows of stone farmhouses and from concealed positions in the tree lines, casualties mounted at a horrifying pace. Rifle companies that had jumped into Normandy at full strength were reduced to half, then a third, then a quarter of their original numbers. Funk and Company C fought through it, day after grinding day. They took casualties. They absorbed replacements who had never seen combat and integrated them into the unit while under fire. They developed techniques for breaching hedgerows, working with tanks that had been fitted with steel cutting devices welded to their hulls to slash through the earthen walls. They learned that every new field was a new battle. By September, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and driven the Germans east toward their own borders. The Allied High Command believed one daring stroke could end the war before Christmas. The result was Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation ever attempted. The plan called for dropping approximately 35,000 paratroopers behind German lines in the Netherlands to seize a series of key bridges over the major rivers and canals that blocked the Allied advance. If the bridges could be captured intact, a British armoured column would race north along a single highway, cross the bridges, and burst into the open plains of northern Germany, outflanking the entire Siegfried Line and potentially ending the war in weeks. Among the 82nd Airborne's primary objectives was the massive road bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen, along with bridges over the Maas River and the critical Groesbeek Heights. Funk and Company C jumped into Holland on September 17, 1944, the first day of the operation. The fighting was immediate and ferocious. German forces threw everything they had at the airborne troops, desperate to destroy them before ground reinforcements could arrive. Counterattacks came daily. The paratroopers fought for every crossroad, every village, and every bridge approach. On September 18, near a location identified in American records as Vauxhall, likely the Dutch village of Vossenhol outside Nijmegen, Funk spotted a crisis developing. 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns were firing directly into American gliders attempting to land. These gliders carried reinforcements, heavy weapons, ammunition, artillery pieces, jeeps, and medical supplies. They were the lifeline of the airborne operation. Every glider destroyed in the air was a blow to the entire mission. Funk made a decision that defied every tactical calculation. He grabbed 2 men, just 2, 3 Americans against 3 fortified flak positions, each manned by a full gun crew. He led the assault personally, advancing directly into the teeth of the enemy positions, firing his Thompson as he closed the distance. His 2 soldiers flanked to the left and right. The attack was so fast and so violent and so utterly unexpected that the German gun crews never recovered. The flak weapons were designed to track aircraft at altitude, not engage infantry charging at point-blank range. One by one, the positions were overrun. The official Distinguished Service Cross citation recorded the result. Approximately 20 members of the gun crews were killed, 3 soldiers, 3 gun positions, 20 dead enemy. Every weapon silenced. The gliders landed safely. Leonard Funk received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in the United States Army. Only the Medal of Honor ranked above it. His men had given him a nickname by then, according to accounts published decades later in Military History magazine. They called him Napoleon. 5 feet 5 inches of concentrated fury. If you want to know what happened when that German officer shoved a pistol into his stomach, hit that like button right now. Every single like pushes this video to someone who has never heard the name Leonard Funk. He deserves to be heard. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. December 16, 1944. The war was supposed to be winding down. Allied intelligence assessments confidently predicted that Germany lacked the reserves for any large-scale offensive operation. The Wehrmacht was bleeding on 2 fronts simultaneously, fighting the Red Army in the east and the British and Americans in the west. German fuel reserves were critically low. Their Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies over Western Europe. Their best divisions had been ground to fragments in France and in the hedgerow country. The war would surely be over by spring. These assessments were catastrophically, disastrously wrong. Adolf Hitler had been secretly assembling his last strategic reserve in the forests east of the Ardennes, pulling divisions from quiet sectors across the front, rebuilding shattered panzer formations with the last of Germany's tank production, stockpiling fuel and ammunition for one massive blow. His plan was to repeat the success of 1940, when German forces had driven through the same Ardennes forest and split the Allied armies in 2, leading to the fall of France in 6 weeks. If it worked again, if German armoured spearheads could reach the port of Antwerp and cut the Allied supply line, the Western Allies might be forced to the negotiating table. At 0530 hours on that freezing December morning, 3 German armies under Army Group B, containing over 200,000 soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and armoured assault guns, smashed into thinly held American positions along a 75-mile stretch of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack hit sectors manned by raw divisions that had never seen combat, and exhausted veteran divisions that had been sent to the quiet Ardennes specifically to rest and recover. They were overwhelmed. German panzer columns punched through the American lines and raced west, creating a massive salient, a bulge, in the Allied front that eventually stretched over 50 miles deep at its furthest penetration. It was the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in the entire European war. Over the next 6 weeks, 19,000 Americans would be killed in action. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The 82nd Airborne Division was at camps near Reims, France, over 200 miles from the fighting, resting and refitting after months of nearly continuous combat. On the evening of December 17, the division was alerted. The Germans were breaking through. Every available combat unit was needed at the front immediately. There was no time for airborne operations. Early the next morning, December 18, the paratroopers were loaded onto open-topped trucks in freezing rain and driven north toward Belgium. They had no winter camouflage. Many lacked heavy weapons and cold weather gear. Some soldiers did not even have full ammunition loads. They were being rushed forward to plug a gap before the entire Allied line collapsed. The 82nd arrived at Werbeumont, Belgium, on the evening of December 18, and was thrown into the line immediately. The division held the critical northern shoulder of the Bulge, blocking the German advance from spreading further north and potentially cutting off the entire Allied army in the west. They faced some of the most capable units the German military still possessed, including elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army and the notorious Kampfgruppe Peiper, a spearhead of SS Panzer troops already responsible for the massacre of unarmed American prisoners at Malmedy. The conditions were the worst any American unit endured in the European war. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Snow piled waist-deep in the Ardennes forests. Dense fog rolled in and stayed for days, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards and grounding the Allied air forces that were the Americans' greatest advantage. The ground froze so hard that entrenching tools bounced off the earth like it was concrete. Soldiers could not dig foxholes. They piled snow and frozen clods of dirt into low walls and pressed their bodies against the earth, praying that the thin barrier would stop a bullet or absorb shrapnel. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Men lost fingers and toes and entire feet to the cold. Trench foot crippled soldiers who could not keep their boots dry. Medical supplies ran critically short. Morphine froze in its syrettes. Plasma froze before it could be administered. Hot food was a distant memory. Men survived on cold rations, melted snow, and willpower. For over a month, the 82nd Airborne fought in these conditions without relief. They held their sector against repeated German assaults. They counterattacked when ordered. They patrolled in sub-zero darkness. They did not retreat. They did not break. Leonard Funk was in the center of it, every day, every night. First Sergeant of Company C. The man who walked the line when the shelling stopped and checked on every position. The man who redistributed ammunition from soldiers who had too much to soldiers who had too little. The man who dragged wounded men to aid stations through the snow. The man who kept Company C functioning as a fighting unit when exhaustion, cold, and casualties should have destroyed it. By late January 1945, the German offensive had finally collapsed. The Bulge was shrinking as Allied forces pressed in from north and south. The 82nd Airborne shifted from defense to attack, pushing east through the wreckage of the former salient, driving shattered German units back toward the Siegfried Line, the fortified wall along Germany's western border. On January 29, Company C received orders. Advance 15 miles and seize the village of Holzheim, a small settlement near the Belgian border with Germany. The mission sounded straightforward. The execution was anything but. A full-scale blizzard was hammering the area. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Snowdrifts reached waist height and higher in the open farm fields between the line of departure and the objective. The company was badly under strength. Weeks of Ardennes combat had chewed through its ranks. Replacements had not arrived. The men who remained were running on fumes, kept moving by tobacco, stubbornness, and the mutual obligation that combat soldiers feel toward each other. They stepped off into the storm. 15 miles through white emptiness, leaning against a wind that sliced through every layer of uniform, boots filling with snow that melted against their skin and then froze again. Weapons seized up as lubricant congealed in the cold. Fingers went numb inside gloves that were never designed for these temperatures. The column stretched out across the white landscape, a line of dark figures moving through a world stripped of every color except grey and white. They reached Holzheim. The company executive officer became a casualty almost immediately. Funk assumed his duties on top of his own responsibilities without breaking stride. He assessed his available strength and made a quick calculation. The rifle platoons were too thin to clear the village alone. He needed more fighters. Funk pulled together headquarters personnel, cooks, clerks, radio operators, message runners, men whose normal jobs kept them behind the combat line. He organized them into an improvised assault element, paired each one with an experienced combat soldier from 3rd Platoon, and led the combined force into the village, house by house, room by room. Door by door, 15 structures to clear. Behind any door could be a machine gun position, a booby trap, a squad of cornered Germans prepared to fight to the last. Funk went through first. Every single time. He kicked in doors with his Thompson at his shoulder and his finger on the trigger. His makeshift team followed. They cleared the first building, then the second, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. The Germans inside Holzheim were caught completely off guard. They had not believed any force could advance 15 miles through that blizzard. They were wrong. Funk's ad hoc unit and 3rd Platoon cleared all 15 houses and took 30 prisoners without suffering a single American casualty. Across the rest of the village, other platoons of Company C achieved similar results. The total prisoner count reached roughly 80 Germans. They were disarmed and corralled in the yard of a large farmhouse. Their weapons were stacked nearby. 4 American soldiers stood guard over them. The village was secured. The mission was complete. Funk moved out on a patrol to sweep the surrounding area for stragglers. While Funk was gone, catastrophe struck. A German patrol entered Holzheim from the east. The official citation would later describe what happened next, simply as a ruse. Whether the Germans wore white camouflage to blend with the snow-covered landscape or used some other deception, the result was the same. The 4 American guards did not recognize the threat until the Germans were close enough to touch them. The deception worked perfectly. The Germans overpowered the guards before a single shot was fired. Within minutes, the 80 disarmed German prisoners had their weapons back. The 4 American guards were stripped of their rifles and forced to stand with their hands raised. The mathematics of the situation had reversed entirely. Instead of 80 prisoners under American control, roughly 100 armed Germans now stood in the center of a village held by an understrength American parachute infantry company. The German force began organizing immediately. They checked weapons. They distributed ammunition. They formed assault teams. Their intention was obvious. They would attack Company C from the rear, while the Americans were scattered through the village finishing mop-up operations. If they achieved surprise, Company C would be caught between 2 fires and destroyed. The entire attack plan for this sector of the Ardennes front would unravel. Adjacent American units pushing forward on parallel axes would find their flanks wide open. One reversed farmyard could cascade into a tactical disaster far beyond one Belgian village. Funk knew nothing of this. He finished his patrol, found the surrounding area clear, and walked back toward the farmhouse where he had left the prisoners. He came around the corner of a stone outbuilding and stepped into the yard. What he saw defied comprehension. His 4 guards had their hands in the air. The 80 prisoners he had personally captured less than an hour before were armed again. German soldiers were everywhere, checking weapons, organizing into groups, pointing and gesturing toward the village where the rest of Company C was still clearing buildings. And standing directly in front of him, less than 3 feet away, was a German officer. The officer reacted before Funk fully processed the scene. He stepped forward and drove a machine pistol, a Maschinenpistole, directly into Funk's midsection. The muzzle jammed against his belt buckle hard enough to push him backward half a step. The officer screamed orders in German. Funk did not understand a word, but a gun in the stomach is a language that requires no translation. "Surrender. You are finished. Drop your weapon." Funk's Thompson submachine gun hung from his right shoulder on its leather sling. It was loaded, 30 rounds. The safety was disengaged, but the weapon was slung, not in his hands. To fire it, he would need to unsling it, bring it to bear, aim, and pull the trigger. That sequence required at least 2 full seconds. The German officer had a loaded weapon pressed against Funk's body. He could fire in a fraction of a heartbeat. The arithmetic was absolute. Funk should surrender. Every rational calculation, every survival instinct, every tactical textbook in every army in the world said the same thing. Put your hands up. You are caught. 100 to 1. No cover, no backup, no options. Just a small man from Pennsylvania with cold steel against his stomach and nothing between him and death except 2 seconds and a decision. Funk started to laugh, or so the story goes. The official citation does not mention laughter. But according to accounts passed down through the men who witnessed it, Funk appeared genuinely, authentically amused by the absurdity of the situation. A man who had jumped into Normandy on a sprained ankle, who had destroyed 3 flak batteries with 2 soldiers, who had survived a month in the frozen Ardennes without breaking, was being told to quit by one officer with a pistol. The German screamed louder. Funk kept laughing. Then he stopped. He raised his hands slowly, carefully, as though he was complying. He reached toward the sling of his Thompson with exaggerated slowness, as though he intended to lift it from his shoulder and hand it over. The German watched. The Americans watched. 80 rearmed German prisoners watched. The entire yard held its breath. Funk's right hand found the pistol grip of the Thompson. In one explosive movement, a movement so fast that witnesses later said they could barely track it with their eyes, he ripped the weapon off his shoulder, brought the muzzle up from his hip, and emptied the entire 30-round magazine into the German officer at a distance of less than 2 feet. The officer was dead before his legs buckled. Funk was already pivoting. He swept the Thompson in an arc across the nearest group of German soldiers, spending the last rounds in the magazine. He screamed at his captured American guards. "Grab their weapons! Fight back! Now!" The guards did not hesitate. They dove for the nearest German rifles on the ground. Chaos consumed the farmyard. Germans scrambled for cover, for weapons, for any escape from the small American who had just killed their officer and was reloading with terrifying speed. Some fired back. Some froze where they stood. Some bolted. Funk slammed a fresh magazine into the Thompson and kept firing. He moved through the yard engaging targets, shouting commands, directing the counterattack with nothing but his voice and his weapon. The 4 freed Americans fought beside him with captured German rifles. The engagement was savage, point-blank, and mercifully brief. It lasted less than 60 seconds. When it was over, 21 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. Many more were wounded. The survivors threw down their weapons and surrendered for the second time that afternoon. Funk stood in the center of the yard. Dead and wounded Germans lay scattered across the frozen ground. Spent brass casings glittered in the snow. His American soldiers gripped enemy rifles, chests heaving, staring at their first sergeant. Funk looked at the carnage and reportedly said something to the effect of, "That was the stupidest thing I have ever seen." The quote is part of airborne legend, not the official record. He was not referring to his own actions. He was referring to the German officer who believed that shoving a gun into the stomach of Leonard Funk would make him surrender. The recaptured prisoners were disarmed again, this time with far greater care and a much heavier guard detail. Company C consolidated its hold on Holzheim. The village was secure. The mission was intact. Funk had single-handedly prevented a catastrophe. 100 armed enemies behind American lines, preparing to attack a scattered company from the rear. It would have been a massacre. The official Medal of Honor citation, authorized under War Department General Orders No. 75, dated September 5, 1945, describes the action in the restrained language of military bureaucracy. It records that First Sergeant Funk, pretending to comply with the order, began slowly to unsling his submachine gun from his shoulder, and then, with lightning motion, brought the muzzle into line and riddled the German officer. He turned upon the other Germans, firing and shouting to the other Americans to seize the enemy weapons. In the ensuing fight, 21 Germans were killed, many wounded, and the remainder captured. The citation concluded that his bold action and heroic disregard for his own safety were directly responsible for the recapture of a vastly superior enemy force which, if allowed to remain free, could have taken the widespread units of Company C by surprise and endangered the entire attack plan. On August 23, 1945, in the East Room of the White House in Washington, President Harry S. Truman stood before 28 United States Army soldiers and presented each of them with the Medal of Honor. The ceremony took place in the same historic room where Abraham Lincoln had hosted wartime receptions during the Civil War. 24 of the recipients standing before Truman that day had served in the European theater. 4 had fought in the Pacific. The room was packed with family members, military officials, and members of the press. First, Sergeant Leonard A. Funk Jr. of Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, stood among the honorees. Truman, himself a World War I artillery captain, who had commanded Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery in France in 1918, was known for telling Medal of Honor recipients that he would rather have the Medal of Honor than be President of the United States. The pale blue ribbon that Truman placed around Funk's neck that afternoon carried the weight of the nation's highest recognition of battlefield valor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It crowned a combat record that had no equal among American paratroopers in any theater of the war. The Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star. 3 Purple Hearts for 3 separate combat wounds sustained across 3 campaigns. The Belgian Croix de Guerre with Palm, the French Fourragère, a unit citation cord earned by the 508th for its actions in Normandy, 2 combat jumps into 2 different countries. 5 feet 5 inches tall, 140 pounds, a former store clerk who became one of the most decorated paratroopers of the Second World War. The war ended, the parades faded, the nation turned its attention to peace and prosperity and forgetting. Leonard Funk went home to Western Pennsylvania. He was honorably discharged in June of 1945. In 1950, the Army granted him an honorary commission as a first lieutenant in the United States Army Reserve, formally recognizing his service as acting executive officer of Company C during the Ardennes campaign. He chose not to remain in uniform. Instead, he joined the Veterans Administration in the Pittsburgh region and spent the next 27 years of his working life helping other veterans navigate the bureaucratic systems that the government had built to serve the men who had fought its wars. It was quiet work, paperwork, forms and appointments and phone calls and endless procedural compliance. It was the opposite of everything he had done during the war, and perhaps that was the point. The man who had emptied a Thompson into a German officer at point-blank range now sat behind a desk and helped former soldiers file disability claims and access medical care and receive the benefits they had earned. He did it with the same thoroughness he had applied to everything else in his life. He retired in 1972 as Division Chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office of the Veterans Administration, having served veterans for longer than he had served in the Army itself. He married a woman named Gertrude. They raised 2 daughters in the same part of Pennsylvania where Funk had grown up. He lived quietly. He did not seek public attention. He did not write a memoir or tour the speaking circuit. He was a man who had seen the worst that human beings can do to each other and responded by spending his civilian career trying to help the men who had survived it. The paratroopers never forgot. In the barracks and drop zones and mess halls of the 82nd Airborne, the name Leonard Funk was passed from one generation to the next, like a family heirloom. The night jump into Normandy, the 3 flak guns at Nijmegen, the farmyard at Holtzheim, the laugh. Every class of new paratroopers heard the stories and understood what they meant. Size is irrelevant. Odds are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is what you do when the world drops a gun in your gut and tells you to quit. On November 20th, 1992, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. died of cancer in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. He was 76 years old. He had outlived most of the men he had served with. He had outlived the Cold War that followed the conflict he had fought in. At the time of his death, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the World War II, 82nd Airborne Division. 7 days later, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 35, Grave 2373-4, beneath a white marble headstone, identical to the hundreds of thousands that surround it. A soldier among soldiers. The community of Braddock Township and the surrounding boroughs did not allow his memory to disappear into the archives. In 1995, the Pennsylvania State Legislature designated a stretch of Pennsylvania Route 48 as the Leonard A. Funk Jr. Highway. In 2018, he was inducted into the 82nd Airborne Division Hall of Fame at Fort Bragg. In 2023, the United States Post Office in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, was officially renamed the First Sergeant Leonard A. Funk Jr. Post Office Building. A fitness center at Fort Liberty, the installation formerly known as Fort Bragg, carries his name today. Paratroopers train there every morning, pushing themselves through the same physical standards that Funk mastered 8 decades ago. His combat record is studied at Army leadership schools across the country. Instructors present the Holtzheim scenario to classes of young officers and non-commissioned officers. You are a first sergeant. You walk around a corner. 100 armed enemy soldiers fill a yard where 80 disarmed prisoners should be. Your guards are captured. An officer drives a loaded weapon into your stomach. You are outnumbered 100 to 1. There is no textbook solution. There is only the solution Leonard Funk invented in 2 seconds flat. What his story teaches is not a technique that can be drilled into muscle memory. It is something more fundamental and rarer. It is the capacity to reject the obvious conclusion when the obvious conclusion is defeat. Every piece of evidence in that farmyard, said Funk was finished. Every rational mind would have reached the same answer. Surrender, survive, fight another day. Funk's mind processed the same evidence and reached a different conclusion entirely. He saw a loaded Thompson on his shoulder and a German officer too close to miss. He saw 4 American soldiers who would fight if somebody gave them a weapon and a command. He saw that hesitation was death, but action, however insane, was at least a chance, and he took it. That is what the Medal of Honor recognizes. Not recklessness, not luck, not physical size or brute strength. The deliberate choice to act when every calculation says, stop. The willingness to accept the worst possible outcome if the alternative is abandoning the men who depend on you. Holzheim is quiet now. The stone farmhouses still stand along the road near the German border. Snow still buries the fields every January, the same snow that swallowed men to their waists 80 years ago. No monument marks the yard where it happened. The moment exists only in official records and in the institutional memory of the airborne community. But moments like that do not need monuments. They need witnesses. They need people willing to hear the name and remember it. You are that witness now. You know the name Leonard Funk. You know what he did. Share this story. Hit the like button. Not for the algorithm. For a 5'5" store clerk from Pennsylvania who laughed with a gun in his stomach and chose to fight when the entire world told him to stop, subscribe and turn on notifications. We search through Medal of Honor citations, through archived military records, through decades of forgotten paperwork to find men whose stories have been buried in government filing cabinets since the last century. We bring those stories to daylight. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family wore a uniform, in any branch, in any conflict, in any era. Write their name. This comment section is a roll call, and every name written here matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying to the end. And thank you for ensuring that First Sergeant Leonard A. Funk Jr., the smallest man in the 82nd Airborne who fought larger than anyone around him, will never be forgotten.